You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, a warning from the President of Palau that his and other nations are at real risk of disappearing as a group of small island states prepare a legal case against the world's biggest polluters.
We should not ever live in a world where we would have to go to textbooks or history books to learn about these islands and those cultures and those people, because they vanished because of climate change.
New technology that helps the shipping industry use less fuel and reduce emissions by keeping vessels clean. And a winter heat wave flames wildfires in California, forcing dozens to flee their homes. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. The President of Palau is warning that small island nations such as his are at real risk of vanishing. Rising sea levels and increasingly frequent extreme weather events are already having a devastating effect on his small country. And that's why he and other leaders of small island states on the front line of the climate crisis are preparing a legal case against the world's biggest polluters. Palau is an archipelago of over 340 coral and volcanic islands, of which only 10 are inhabited, surrounded by a single barrier reef. As a low-lying island nation, it's on the front line of the effects of climate change. Low-lying small islands in the Pacific are disproportionately at risk of losing land as sea levels are set to rise by an expected 26 to 82 centimetres by the late 21st century, according to data from the UN. Now, that's despite the fact that Pacific small island nation states combined are responsible for a mere 0.03% of global emissions. Well, earlier I spoke to President Surangel Whips Jr., who told me how the climate crisis is directly affecting people's lives in Palau.
Probably our biggest challenge is that before we didn't experience storms, frequency of storms. In the past year, we've had typhoons, monsoons, taken out roads, destroyed homes. And being where we were located closer to the equator, we weren't in what we call the typhoon belt. So that's a direct result of the change in climate. The other things that we see is the rising sea levels. So we have in the high tides now homes being flooded, taro patches, or we call them taro swamps, where we get our food, also getting inundated with seawater. But it doesn't just stop there. We also have impacts to our coral reefs. When we have droughts and severe drought events, we've lost reef habitats to coral bleaching. We also see a reduction in fish stock because of the warming seas. So those are all challenges that we face each day. And maybe at Glasgow, if you recall, the term I used is, you might as well bomb us instead of just having us suffer through this continuous struggle that we face. And that's why it's so important that we all rise up to the challenge and really work together to find innovative ways to solve the climate crisis and the challenges that we have.
Were you reassured by what was agreed at COP26, for example? Wealthy countries there, for example, promised to double adaptation finance for vulnerable countries by 2025. Do you feel that progress is really being made?
You know, every little step counts. But, you know, I think we need to encourage our friends that said we need to start taking bigger steps. And COP26 was definitely a ray of hope that I think we're going in the right direction. And, you know, I want to thank France for being the first country this year to have the One Ocean conference and summit in France. And I think what we want to build on is those commitments that were made. We need to increase the work, whether it's in marine pollution and in protecting our seas, IUU, and also just sustainably managing our oceans and really producing a sustainable blue economy. Those are really the initiatives that we need to work on together. And our larger friends that are making a bigger impact on climate change need to step it up and also contribute to the climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And we would like to see more. And I think that's why it's important that we have these conferences and continue to push the ball momentum forward. Because if we don't, as my friends from the Marshall Islands, and they had me represent them at the high level high ambition panel at Glasgow, said, you know, if we don't turn this around at this conference, we're going under. And why should any country or any island disappear because we didn't make the choices, the hard choices?
You've joined the Commission of Small Island States, COSIS, on climate change and international law to bring a case to the UN International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So tell us what you're trying to achieve with that action and why you feel it's necessary to take it.
As small islands, we see the change happening. We suffer it every day. So really the intent is to raise that awareness and to make people understand that the choices that you make every day impact the lives of people around the world, and especially small island states. So make the right choices. You know, bringing that action is to encourage people to change, to make those commitments, and to make the right decisions. So hopefully, by saying the large polluters pay, they will take responsibility. You don't have to pay. You don't have to pay if you make those changes. But we need them to make those commitments and stick to them and act more aggressively.
Is it hard to feel listened to when you're such a small nation, just 18,000 people?
Yes, we're small, and it's hard to find us on the map. And I think sometimes that's why we're forgotten. But you know, one of the things that that's so important by these conferences and these events, it's allowed us to raise that awareness, raise that voice. And you know, we appreciate Sky News taking the time to reach out to us and give us the opportunity to share the challenges that we have on our small islands, so that the world knows that we should not ever live in a world where we would have to go to textbooks or history books to learn about these islands and those cultures and those people, because they vanished because of climate change. We don't want to ever see that, and I believe that this generation in the world can make a difference, and it really requires all of us working together.
Now for some of the day's other climate news. And a wildfire fanned by gusty winds has erupted in hills on the southern California coast and is burning near homes. The city of Laguna Beach ordered an immediate evacuation for residents and closed the Pacific Coast Highway in both directions. Drax Power has pleaded not guilty to allegations that wood dust from its biomass pellets posed a risk to employees' health, safety and welfare at work. It's also charged with failing to make a suitable risk assessment before allowing employees to work with potentially hazardous substances at the biomass power station in Selby, which is the largest of its kind in the UK. The trial was today scheduled for June 2023. There are concerns that Northern Ireland's first legally binding Climate Act might not be passed before the devolved institutions at Stormont are dissolved next month, following the resignation of its First Minister. The amended bill will see the introduction of a 2050 net zero target for Northern Ireland, along with an independent Climate Change Commissioner's office. Australian energy giant AGL has said it will close two of its biggest coal-fired plants several years earlier than planned in an effort to take a leading role in Australia's energy transition. AGL's chief executive said the acceleration would cut its emissions by 18 to 27% during the 2025 to 2045 period, compared with 2019 levels. However, climate groups have dismissed the amended schedule, saying it's a token effort. 70% of households in Somalia do not have enough food to eat as the country continues to experience its worst drought in a decade. Save the Children says millions are going hungry and being forced from their homes in search of food and water. The UN has warned East Africa is the region most at risk from near-term climate impacts, with 3/4 of all displacement in Somalia in 2021 attributed to flooding or drought. The Duke of Cambridge has told children, "You are the future," while planting carbon-capturing mangrove saplings in the United Arab Emirates. Climate change-conscious Prince William has been learning about efforts to safeguard wetlands with the son of Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince, Sheikh Khaled. Now, the world's shipping industry is responsible for hundreds of millions of tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions every year. So just like most industries, the race is on to find ways to clean up. Well, one company in Coventry has found a way to help ships use less fuel and reduce emissions by keeping them free of crustaceans. Madeleine Ratcliffe explains.
How do you reduce the amount of fuel you need to run boats, saving money and reducing carbon emissions at the same time? Well, it can be as simple as getting rid of the barnacles on the boat. This build-up of weed and shells slows boats down and makes them less efficient, so they burn more fuel and release more carbon dioxide. But one company might have the answer.
Quite simply, the ultrasonic sound wave, when it leaves the vessel, creates tiny bubbles, a tiny agitation. And when those bubbles very carefully and slowly implode, it destroys single-cell organisms. That's the food source for the weed, for the barnacles, for the mussels. If there's nothing to eat, there's nothing will grow.
This all matters because the global shipping industry is so polluting. It produces about 940 million tonnes of CO2 a year. That's about 2.5% of global emissions. So even a small reduction in the amount of fuel burned can make a big difference.
If you imagine a container ship, if it's got no fouling, it would be the equivalent of switching tens of thousands of people from their diesel car to an electric car. That is the difference it is making.
Andrea is investigating how to make ships more efficient. Crucial, he says, to cope with increasing consumer demand in a sustainable way.
We want ships to be delivering our items at the same rate without making larger ships. The only alternative is at the same speed or faster. And that means that having fuel-efficient ships is critical. In general, the less algae or barnacles you have on a hull, the better the fuel consumption will be.
In the fight against global warming and reducing carbon emissions, it's often the little things that make a big difference. Something as small even as keeping your boat clean. Madeleine Ratcliffe, Sky News in Southampton.
To stay with us, coming up, I'll be joined by the director and founder of Uplift, Tessa Khan, and Dan Caesar, chief executive of the Fully Charged show. And we'll be asking if small island nations are being heard as they fight for more aggressive action to cut emissions by the world's largest polluters. And could insulation be the solution to the energy crisis? All that to come. Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Tessa Khan from Uplift UK and Dan Caesar of the Fully Charged channel. So very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So first of all, climate change and its devastating effects are already here. That's the clear message that we heard today from the President of Palau, a string of pristine islands in the South Pacific. Palau is home to around 18,000 people. So how can countries on the front line of the climate crisis, often tiny, have a voice in the global debate? And Tessa, one way that the President of Palau was telling me that he was trying to have his voice heard was by taking legal action, joining a group of small island states and taking a case to a UN tribunal. How unusual is a case like that, and what might it be able to achieve?
Well, Anna, these sorts of cases, basically people turning to courts to try to find new ways to get governments to speed up the pace and scale at which they're reducing carbon emissions, that in itself isn't unusual at the national level. What's unusual here is that Palau and these other Pacific Island states who are facing such an imminent and massive threat, to their very existence, that they're collectively acting as a set of governments to really clarify the obligations of other countries, and, principally richer countries with higher historical responsibility for climate change, like the UK, which is in the top 10 countries in the world in terms of its historical contribution to carbon emissions. They're trying to clarify exactly what the legal obligations are under international law for those countries in terms of having to reduce emissions and support countries like Palau that are really at the front lines of climate change, of the climate crisis, despite having done so little to contribute to it. And you can certainly understand why they would do that, given that we are effectively still traveling in the wrong direction in terms of reducing emissions at the pace that we need to stay within a safe climate, that critical 1.5 degree threshold that's especially important for small islands. And you've got governments like the UK at the moment considering opening up new oil and gas fields, at a time when the world's energy and climate experts couldn't be clearer that that is incompatible with a livable climate. So I think
that's a whole topic that we've talked about a few times this week, and I'm sure we'll come back to you again another time, Tessa. But Dan, these small island states are the ones who are bearing the brunt of climate change at the moment, and yet in the case of Palau, the president was very clear as saying, I know that most people couldn't even find it on a map. So what does that mean for public awareness, do you think? Do you think that people here will listen to those pleas, or do they think, well, I haven't heard of Palau in some cases? What do you think? How much resonance can his message have?
Well, my heart went out to him. I was listening to that very kind of moving clip, and unfortunately, we lack empathy as a species. We know that, and it's very much a case of out of sight, out of mind with these things. I mean, I think that in World War II there was twinning of cities, and I wonder if places like Palau should be twinned with places like Portsmouth, and they should have like digital communication so people can see on the ground here in the UK what's going on elsewhere. Otherwise, it's just too remote. It's just too big to tackle. These people are going through things right now, and we need to kind of raise awareness of that.
And Tessa, how important is it to get public opinion on board elsewhere in the world? And can legal action make a difference in that?
Well, I think, we should be clear that even though the UK isn't quite as vulnerable as a country like Palau, the UK is certainly not immune to the impacts of the climate crisis. There are already tens of thousands of people and businesses people whose homes have been destroyed by flooding, who have had to relocate in recent years as rainfall becomes more intense and more frequent in some parts of the country. So I don't think we need to look elsewhere to really appreciate what the climate crisis means for all of us. But legal action like the one that the government of Palau is pursuing is certainly a way, I think, to really clearly tell a story about the fact that governments have been making promises for decades now at the international level under these UN climate agreements and so on to take action on climate change. And those promises have, for the most part, gone fulfilled, and to support vulnerable countries like Palau to adapt to and cope with the impacts of climate change. So I think it's really important that people understand that this isn't, something new. This is something that governments have been promising and failing to address now for many years.
Dan, I quickly want to bring you in. Just the thought that, do you think that ultimately people are only really going to take action when their own basement's been flooded, rather than seeing somebody from a far away land talking about their issues?
I hope not, but the cynic in me says that could be the case. I think we just need, platforms like Sky to raise the issue more and more. People have got to kind of realise that every action in this part of the world has effects elsewhere. And, as you just heard, things are happening here now as well. So I really hope people start to wake up to this and get the message.
OK, let's move on to our next topic, shall we? Because the UK's Climate Change Committee is the government's official advisory body on climate policy. So comments by its chief, Chris Stark, might get some traction. Now, he said in an interview that the government's policy on home insulation is very poor. And he says it's insulation as well as renewable power which is holding the key to solving the current energy crisis. And Dan, criticism of the government's policy then on insulation. And do you agree then with Chris Stark that it's a way out of the current energy crisis, good for people's bills, good for the planet?
100%. I think Chris is actually quite moderate in his criticism of the government on this. They have consistently failed on insulation. You don't necessarily need to look at an energy performance certificate of your house to know if it is cold or drafty. There's much more that you can do, but the government needs to step up to the plate on insulation. What quite often conflated is electricity and heat, and heating and hot water is the larger portion of your bill. And if you're, burning fossil fuels in your house, the gas boiler or something similar, it's absolutely galling to see that heat leave through doors, floors, windows and chimneys. And you can get your house insulated, but even before that, I would so strongly suggest working out where the weaknesses, the weak points are in your house, and just employing draft exclusion, for example.
Well, yes, some really good tips. And Tessa, the thing is that people might even be aware that if they improve their insulation, they can save a bit of money. But often it involves an upfront cost, doesn't it? And people are facing a squeeze on their wallets already.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the cost of our current dependency on both gas to heat our homes, the failure of the UK government, especially when you compare it to how quickly other European governments, for example, have managed to insulate and make homes more energy efficient. It's really clear that this is a political choice that the government has made, not to prioritise not just the climate cost of continuing to burn fossil fuels to heat our homes, but also the costs, as you say, to people's bills, which are being driven by our dependency on gas, and to people's health, and the quality of life that people are really going to have to compromise as they try and reduce and conserve their energy use, just so that they don't get stuck with these completely, unimaginably difficult energy bills at the end of the month. So, the costs of doing this, the cost of failing to really take the way in which the UK's housing stock is dependent on fossil fuels and ultimately not consistent with what people need to lead a comfortable life is incredibly high.
Yeah, and the government obviously would talk about all its energy that it's putting into renewables at the moment. It would point out that it's a leader in wind power, for example, and that it would say it's got plans for trying to make sure that our homes are more energy efficient as well. Dan, practically, people often don't know where to start, do they, when they're looking to insulate their home or do other energy efficient measures? Have you got any particular tips that people should try out?
So certainly draft exclusion would be a key thing, but there are other things that you can do. A short shower is much better than a deep bath in terms of the amount of energy you use to heat up that water. Things like aerated shower heads are relatively cheap and easy to install. Smart thermostats, which mean you don't have to have your heating on in every room. You can have it in the rooms where you need it, and have clever things to make sure you're being as energy efficient as possible. And to be honest, this problem is not going away. In fact, I'd urge people to spend the spring and summer, when things get a bit warmer, to start planning for autumn and winter. The gas cost of gas is going to potentially get worse. We've heard that. Ultimately, boiler replacements will get cheaper. Things like air source heat pumps have a huge role to play, and there are companies working really hard to get the cost of those down to a comparable level. But ultimately, there are things you can do that are cheaper. And yeah, I'd suggest let's get ready for next winter.
OK, so some good tips there. Well, Tessa Khan and Dan Caesar, very interesting to get your views and your advice. Thanks very much indeed. So that's it from me for today, but tomorrow I'll be joined by climate activist Laura Young and Michael Jacobs, Professor of Political Economy at the University of Sheffield. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.